Great. All right. This is good enough.
There you go.
Okay.
Okay.
So
Let's go back.
before you start, I want to thank Michael and Kara for coming back on real quick and talking briefly, but I think we're going to move on. And so take it away, Michael, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your patience. Um, okay, I'm going to talk about this model that I developed over the decades since the 1980s. It all started when people were calling the anthropology department that I was in at the time, and still are, but I've really moved to the human services department because I became the department chair for a number of years. But when I was in anthropology for about 25 years, we'd get phone calls and people were having problem with different diversity issues in their work environments, and any imaginable work environment, from education to civic government to business to human services. Anyway, so the upshot is I created a certificate program, and at that time it was called Managing in Multicultural Work Environments. And that went on for about 10 years, and I was doing work teaching, but also working in different community agencies. And in 1999, based on that experience with all these different groups in organizations dealing with diversity issues, I published my workbook that had come together through interactions in that context. Here, the next slide shows some of the issues to just give you a flavor, which you probably are already familiar. These are some of the critical incidents that they would ask, okay, what do we do about this? Like with this one with Native American, or the second one, child from Haiti in the schools and the way that child is being treated as other. Gender issue here, the female staff, and she's greeted with this comment and she's offended. The next one, the counselor, and the whole gender issue here, and age. So there's some intersectionality there. And anyway, you get the idea of these. And so I established this certificate program. And through doing this, I started teaching them essentially the ethnographic method. What was underlying this model that I'll go through today briefly, based on this grant that the School of Nursing at Cal State Fullerton got. They needed some cultural understanding because they were bringing in students who were first generation, and they want them to become nurses to increase the diversity of our nurses dealing with in the hospitals and such, and all the different incidents that come up every single day. So the underlying principles behind this model I'm going to present that was developed in that context: culture concept, contextualization, cultural interpretation. These are just some of the basic underlying features. Cultural interpretation, I think they learned that from the previous presentation on fiction writing, seeing things from a different perspective, knowing there's a different meaning system, comparison, holism, emic and etic, insider and outsider, self-reflection, this ability to identify in ourselves how we respond to things, how that affects our identity and our orientation to our meaning system, non-judgmental orientation. So these are the principles. This last one, the cultural context model, this is something I've been reading about in the last few years. This stems from a family services agency in New Jersey, and the model they use is based on 3 elements. One, developing critical consciousness of the families that they're helping. They use a social justice model. And so there's critical consciousness, and this relates to holism, the holistic approach, the larger perspective, and critical consciousness, also the different relations between social groups over time, the hierarchies, rankings, and the maltreatment of discrimination, which you'll see play out. But their culture change, and what was informing me and still does, that I reflect on my model in relation to the cultural context model, is they're saying the need for culture change, we need critical consciousness, the development of that. And as you mentioned in the previous presentation, so often people don't even know the culture concept. They just think they go through the day and do what they do because this is what they've always done and they don't even think about it. So critical consciousness, empowerment, and accountability. And all three of those elements are built into this process of these skills that I've developed based on an ethnographic um, principles. And let's go to the next one. Okay. Okay, so here now the School of Nursing got a 4-year grant. It's a HRSA grant, Nursing Workforce Diversity Grant, and they call it EMBRACE. The acronym means Enrichment Markers of Better Relationships, Academics, and Cultural Enhancement. So it's a 4-year grant, and my role in it was to train faculty, staff, and administration so that they can work effectively across their differences and even know about their biases, this implicit and explicit bias, which you'll see. So the first 2 years, in the context of the department, they didn't have time for a training like once a month for an hour. I used 20 minutes to 30 minutes at faculty meetings, and I would just have it ready. I would go in and I would pick up from the last time, and they would have, of course, the handouts and the PowerPoints. So my method was very hands-on method, because this is the way I teach. You present like the cultural skills I'm going to talk about in a minute, demonstrate, use film, something that demonstrates the key concepts of it, and then have them discuss how they responded to that concept or that cultural skill. Practice, this is where cultural simulations, we do role plays, case analysis was big with this group because I only had 20 or 30 minutes. And then structured debriefing. And by that, what did you learn about yourself from doing this? What did you learn about others? How can you use what you learned in a practical way today or tomorrow in your work environment or your family, whatever group you want to use this in? And then debriefing. And this is where self-reflection comes in. Debrief the structured debrief. And anyway, so that was the presentation mode that I use. Now let's look at, all right, here's the I call them 4 cultural skills. Here's a definition of culture. Madeline Leininger in Transcultural Nursing is very influential. Learned, shared, transmitted values, beliefs, norms, and life ways of a group, which are generally transmitted intergenerationally and influence one's thinking and action mode. So that's a general sense of the culture concept I use. And so for the first skill, I introduce them to culture as multidimensional and multi-level, so that they get this holistic view of the system of relationships and beliefs that we are born into and perhaps carry out through we always change it, as you know. Okay, so for the first one is the first cultural skill, understanding culture as multidimensional and multi-level, as I said. The conceptual tool I use for multidimensional are the aspects of culture, and that's this next slide. So here are categories, and in the workbook, they have the workbook that they use. Each one of these are defined so that they can see these different dimensions of culture, what we call culture as our way of life. In relation to social group interaction patterns, this is a very important part of it, because this is where diversity and inclusion comes in. Intergroup relations and intragroup relations, and the power hierarchies that we are born into in our families, in our work organizations, institutions that we live in, values, language and communication, family life processes. This is all encompassing in regard to marriage customs, parenting beliefs and practices, how we treat our elderly as they grow older, divorce, etc. Healing beliefs, religion, art and expressive forms, foods that we eat, diet, recreation, and clothes. So this is something, again, I took from and adapted from transcultural nursing years back, as a tool for them to understand what I mean by this concept of culture, and that it's very complex, and this gives them a holistic view of some of the dimensions of it. Then we move to the levels of culture. So it's multidimensional, the aspects, and here's the level and we do exercises where they identify the aspects of culture at the personal level, then ethnic subculture level. And here in Southern California, there are about 8 different culture groups in Orange County, where I live, that in the social services agencies, trying to understand their cultures and their languages. That would just be an example of it. Korean, Vietnamese, um, Farsi speakers, of course, Latinx population. We only have about 3% African Americans in Orange County, 3 or 4%. So anyway, ethnic subculture level. So they're doing activities identifying aspects for each one of these. Then we get to mainstream US culture. And one of the things I'll just point out are these narrative themes of mainstream culture that I borrowed from and adapted from uh, what's her name? She's at Harvard. It'll come to me. Anyway, she talks about Americans we're taught and socialized in regard to diversity that Americans don't have a culture. We're just individuals. Everybody else, like you said in a previous presentation, the community, but we're individuals. The US social system is fair. Here's meritocracy, belief, colorblind, level playing field. Another theme of in regard to diversity is if it's different, it's wrong, different from the white, Eurocentric, Christian, white male norm. Never talk about diversity and never admit to prejudice. Well, look at how the mainstream culture, just in the last few weeks, the directive to universities and anyone receiving a federal grant, you're not supposed to talk about race. Don't mention the word intersectionality. There's an example right there of that theme today with this current administration. Now notice then organization and institutional level culture. So that's the 4th level. So they identify aspects of culture with each one of these and keeping in mind these themes about diversity. And then we do case analysis. So this is the first conceptual tool, understanding aspects, understanding levels. And I think that gives a good foundation for them to start understanding some of the complexity of diversity. Then we move to the barriers of social group interactions. And this includes the verbal, if you speak a person's language or dialect, nonverbal, all of these, stereotypes and discrimination, misinformation, missing information, implicit, explicit bias, overgeneralizing, and then seeing the role between this and discriminatory treatment, judgment, stress, and then notice, again, multi-level. The barriers are multi-level. For 1 through 5 barriers operate personal, interpersonal level, and we mustn't ever leave out the organization, institutions, policies, and procedures, and whether or not they are inclusive. And as we know, they are not historically. And this is what some of the inclusion issues in our department and school that we're addressing now is how to become an inclusive department and university. Okay, so that's the second skill, is these barriers. And then here in this slide, I tried to show the relationship between the tool, the conceptual tool aspects of culture. Now notice in social group interaction patterns, the levels of culture, personal, ethnic group, mainstream culture and organization, and then the barriers that also occur with social group interaction patterns. So this shows that relationship. And okay, now let's move over here. So, and then we're doing case analysis. The third skill is moving now away from the conceptual tools to dialogue, because that is the crux of getting the image. That's the crux of learning about other people and their different cultures, their different perspectives, experiences. And so this culturally centered dialogue skills has 2 parts. First are these competency behaviors that I identified, and that's just showing the relationship between these behaviors and the capacity, because if we go along with mainstream culture, we really don't have a capacity to deal with diversity, because when we see diversity, we assume it's wrong, and then there's all the stereotypes that come in. So these competency behaviors promote respect, promote understanding through dialogue, okay? And here's the self-test that they take. Again, to bring it back to themselves and how they relate to these, to deepen their understanding of these processes, these cultural processes. And so they take this self-test, and then dialogue, as I said, is the skill that we use to problem solve. So let's look at dialogue and problem solving. Process comes at different levels also. So first, dialogue is exchange of information. I define it. It's based on the premise of mutual respect and open inquiry. See, there is the cultural relativism or being non-judgmental. So it's not about proving you're right. And then the competencies underlie this ability to engage in dialogue. At least this is what I've been working with, and it seems to resonate with the people in the trainings and my students in my classes. Here's dialogue process: establish ground rules such as everybody's going to be heard. Make sure you listen with undivided attention, otherwise you're not living up to the rules that you just laid down for everyone. Then there's some communication skills that I go over. Paraphrasing. This is a way of demonstrating that you're listening in a respectful way. And then, of course, tell your viewpoint. So that would be the dialogue process, just to give you an idea of some of how this skill plays out. And then we use dialogue for conflict intervention. And again, here's a process that I've laid out and we practice this before they do their case analysis using the conceptual tools of aspects, levels, and barriers. Okay. And so here again, here's the problem solving process again. Howard Stein has entered the waiting. Oh, okay. Anyway, so here is the dialogue process to use for problem solving. And again, it's an inclusive process. And here is where people who are participating in this process, this is an empowering experience. So you see how those principles that I mentioned early on are embedded in this process of these, what I call 4 skills. Okay, and here we use moving now to implementing the organization-wide, we use dialogue for action planning, and that's action planning, that's skill 4, design and implement organization-wide plans for inclusion of diversity. And so this again, and I provide them with more tools here, and they can also come up with their own strategies for intervening in issues. And let's see here, I'll show you how this comes together now. So here is when we have gotten to this point of the training or the semester in a regular classroom, this is where they come up with case examples to analyze and to come up with an action plan intervention. So here, just to see how it encompasses diversity, they come up with a diversity issue they've heard about or experienced themselves. And it can be related to elements of diversity of gender, ethnicity, race, age, religion, sexual orientation, sexual identity, social economic status. You see all the different elements of diversity that can be built into these case examples. And I tell them they don't have to use one of their own if they're uncomfortable. They can something that they've heard about or witnessed. And then if they do it in a group, then they also have group support and dialogue, and there's rapport established in this process by the time we get to this 4th skill. Here's one that came from the trainings. Remember the first 2 years with the nursing school, I participated in these trainings at their faculty meetings. So here's one of the case examples that they had to analyze using this process. And this is the one I went to our medical clinic with my mother and sister because my sister needed to visit the doctor for an injection and my mother needed to turn in paperwork. After my sister received her shot, my mom asked the reception desk where she could turn in the requested documents, and she was told to turn it in at another desk on the other side of the building. We all went to the other reception desk to turn in the papers. However, when my mom told the receptionist she was sent there to turn in the documents, the receptionist said she could not understand my mother because she was speaking Spanish. My mother, who's Mexican, got furious because she knew the reception did speak Spanish because she had heard her speak fluent Spanish on previous visits. Yet the receptionist kept saying she could not understand my mother. My mother told her that she believed she did speak Spanish. The receptionist kept denying and told my mother she certainly did not speak Spanish. Anyway, so this was the cultural issue that was reported and that we worked with at that session. My mom then went back to the first reception desk, complained about the receptionist to the nurse. The nurse seemed confused and said, yes, the other receptionist does speak Spanish, all the time, in fact. After the manager spoke to the second receptionist, she then spoke Spanish to my mother, but she fumbled the pronunciation of words, and my mother felt deeply offended. So that is a case example that we worked in one of the trainings of the School of Nursing faculty and staff. And here is the action planning, where you can see how the previous skills are put together in this practice of action planning. So they form into groups. What aspects and levels of culture do you see in the case? They discuss that with dialogue. And after this is over, I ask them, how well did you do with your dialogue? Were you able to participate? What are the competency behaviors? And they say, well, I have to be patient, had to listen carefully, and so on. So again, that's bringing up to awareness some of these skills that they can employ in order to learn from others about their diversity issues and then problem solve those, not just at the interpersonal level, but also for the whole department or school of nursing in this case. What barriers do you see? What competency behaviors would improve the situation in the case, like manage our biases, stop being judgmental, or at least working on it, because we all do it. And then question number 4, which organization strategies would help the organization become more culturally competent or inclusive, in the sense of using of cultural competence here? And here are some of the tools I give them for that. Here's the, in my introduction to this, I talk about there's relations within your organization, or in this case, the School of Nursing, and there's relations external. So internal organization, faculty to faculty, faculty to staff, staff to administration, administration, et cetera, all those different relationship angles. Here are the internal organization strategies that when they're working on this case example action planning part of the process, they can draw on these. And in the workbook, underneath each one of these categories, I have lists of actual tactics and strategies used in organizations and agencies throughout actually Southern California, where I've done this training, that I brought in here to see what other organizations are doing in order to make sure at least they're starting to become an inclusive organization. So these are the internal organization strategies. And then here's the ones dealing, if your organization is providing service to the community, here are some. And again, each one of these has a lot of other tactics and strategies underneath these headings that I've included in the workbook, so they'll see what other organizations are doing to do outreach. This slide, it didn't come across, but I'm showing here the relationship between these skills, cultural skills. Here's apply anthropological principles, personal level, interpersonal level, and then organization level. And then here's the cultural knowledge. And here is where the aspects of culture and barriers come in at these different levels that they identify. And then at the organization level under cultural knowledge, to scrutinize their policies, programs, procedures, processes in regard, and everybody's input into that. And I give them resources too of others who are working on pedagogical, curricular, structure, process elements to show how they're not inclusive. One example at a hospital, when a person walks in who's gay and they see male, female, or if they're trans, they see male, female bathrooms, there, right there is the binary. There, that in itself is a cultural statement of binary assumptions, okay, about sexuality. And so they start seeing how this affects people's experience within that institution because of this structure. And then here, in this column, the skills here, the 14 personal competencies at the personal level, and then the obtaining accurate information through the dialogue process, IMIC information, and exchanging that information, and then action planning is also the practice for this level. And then now, last year was the 3rd year of the grant, and I had to move from the brief encounter trainings, I called them, to self-paced learning modules. I had less time to work with last year, so we had a new department chair, and so I wrote modules so that they could continue doing case examples, taking case examples from what's happening in classrooms, in relations between faculty, in the policies of the School of Nursing, and apply these processes to it to make them more inclusive. So I have 5 modules that I've posted on the Embrace website now, and I'll show you those with this next slide. Here we are. So these are the learning models for self-directed or self-paced learning, cultural mindedness, and culturally centered dialogue. And you can see here, module 1, it talks about the conceptual tool aspects of culture. Module 2 is the levels. Module 3 was the barriers. And here's where we can expand on this one, because some new things when I wrote it into the module. Intersectionality, they want to know more about that. They want to know more about just an array of some of the new terminology that's like white fragility. So if they understood that mainstream culture socialization, for example, orients us not even to ever even talk about it and to feel uncomfortable to even bring up diversity, of course there's going to be fragility if they start hearing about the stories of oppression of their students on their way to school that morning. Okay, so this is what that's about. And then module 5 is their using dialogue to do the action planning, to work on their School of Nursing's processes and programs. And then module 6, I put up resources for them to use. Okay, and then this year, 4th year of the grant, I'm adding a glossary to each of the modules, so it has these terminology and pointing out how terminology has changed over the decades in regard to diversity and inclusion, or multiculturalism, or whatever, cultural competence, whatever term. As you know, probably the terms have changed. And so I'm writing this glossary for each of these self-paced learning modules. And then I'm going to link it to the resources and the different texts and films in the resource module, so that they can also then expand their knowledge base. So again, the whole idea behind it is expanding their knowledge base, critical consciousness, empowerment, and accountability to promote this culture change. And lastly, the conclusion. I've taught applied anthropology for about 20 years, and I used Wolf and Fisk for a long time. So the anthropological difference about my approach to inclusion, it's embedded in these cultural conceptual tools and the culturally centered dialogue technique for use in real communities that allow people to maintain respect for themselves and others, their cultures of origin, and any other groups or associations with whom they regularly identify as they socially interact. Another assumption is of my model, I assume acquiring cultural diversity skills is a lifelong learning endeavor. So you can relax. You can't do it. You can't learn all about a culture, but what you can learn are processes to engage with people, to learn their viewpoint, to learn their experiences, and to share yours with them in this mutual understanding process. So self-reflection in an ongoing, multi-layered process that involves personal, interpersonal, organization, institution levels. It's always in the moment of mutual respect, creativity, agency, authenticity. And then my vision when I first started doing this for the training and education is contained in the skills model, is to work on a person-to-person basis to provide interpersonal foundation, because I don't think we have it if we've just been trained by our mainstream culture. Interpersonal foundation for change while refashioning our hierarchical social structures, starting with our families, work organizations, and changing them into through this process, more collaborative, synergistic partnerships based in respect, inclusion, and social justice. So there it is. So, do you have questions? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Right. Yeah. 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 Thank you.
I was thinking the same thing that about like these intro classes for anthropology, and that
Yeah.
I wish I had had these principles, these frameworks, and
Yeah.
specifically this sort of process of developing those cultural skills. I wish someone had told me that they were skills that needed to be developed.
Yeah.
Um,
And tools. They're actually
and that there
tools.
are tools for you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you
That you don't have to be going in so confused. There are some tools you can use that help clear up and that you can get that information and constantly reflecting in yourself also
yeah,
as a cultural being. And we all are. And yeah, so I mean, and I read, see, when students debrief every one of these, like the aspects of culture, I read students' debriefs and I'm seeing how that impacts them.
Hmm.
And they are starting to understand and they'll go, oh, wow, then I notice, then I won't have to be so critical of so and so and the way their family does stuff. My family is just a different culture. So they do it that way. I do it that. See, they're learning that by actually analyzing critical incidents together and discussing it, applying what, okay, so for that critical incident about the woman who took her mother to the hospital, okay, and she was treated by that receptionist, wouldn't speak Spanish. They'll start, I say, what aspects of culture do you see in that? So they start thinking about culture. And if they can just think about and understand that framework, they really can start understanding their relationships much better, both in with themselves and with others. Yeah.
Hmm.
absolutely. And they also just they give us like the information. I feel like they tell us about elements of culture at the beginning. I'm thinking like it's been a little while, but
Yeah.
the elements of culture at the beginning. They
Yeah.
give you the whole like family tree of anthropology. They
Yeah.
tell you about the work that those folks have done, and they say like, okay, so we're gonna look at this particular ethnography, pick out like what was explained about reciprocity.
Yeah.
Um, and then we're all just sort of supposed to take that in and I guess memorize it or interact with it in that kind of non-active way
Yeah. Yeah.
to
Yeah.
my mind. And so like what would happen if, especially in those intro classes where you have the chance to speak to folks who may not continue with
Yeah.
anthropology, but who can have those skills for their entire lives.
Yes. That's
How
what.
might they apply those skills to biology or to mathematics if they're in those fields?
Yeah.
Understanding kind of what we were talking about before in Michael and Kira's presentation,
Right.
knowing what you don't know
Yeah.
and learning how to get there. That's what's so exciting about
Right.
like the principles you outline and the sort of pathway of it. It's so useful
It is. Yeah.
for learning what you don't know and starting to get there.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's the idea. That's the idea.
Well, I want to
Yeah.
see it I want to see it in anthropology classes across the country.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I mean, my book, my workbook, it's something I use that plus a textbook, for, and then even the classes where I don't use the workbook, because I teach uh, human service delivery to diverse communities. And the first 6 weeks, they learn new skills. So they're not out there, like you were saying previous, the stereotypes that people think in turn, oh my God. So, to make them alert, you got them. So just be quiet and listen until you know what to say, given that it's fraught. In other words, it's fraught with bias and by design,
I
anyway.
think one of the most important things certainly you're doing and that we need to all be doing it when we're teaching is
Uh-huh.
making our knowledge useful to people,
Yeah, yeah,
right? And
yeah,
approaching the world from an anthropological lens
yeah,
is really powerful,
yeah.
and helps your life is less stressful when you
Yeah,
don't make assumptions and you create communication traps and have to deal with, oh crap, what did I just say?
yeah,
And there's less blowback, and you're never going to be perfect, of course,
yeah,
but just knowing a
yeah,
few things can make a world of difference in your level of
absolutely,
stress in your working and home relationships, right? I mean,
absolutely, yes.
so these anthropological tools, I really wish we would just teach them as core subjects for everybody, and we don't even have to guise it in anthropology. We could just dial it. I mean, of course, all of us are required. I mean, I think
Yeah,
most schools require communication classes, but
right,
a lot of those communication classes don't necessarily make things accessible, and they don't think makes things useful. And I
yeah,
think, especially when students are, and I know I have ridiculous student loans that'll never pay off, but especially in this age, we should make our the knowledge that we're giving students as useful and as applicable to their
yeah,
daily lives as possible.
yes,
And I
absolutely.
really liked your presentation for that. So
Oh, thank you. Yeah, yeah, and see, when you have them write the case example in order to identify aspects of culture, in order to see when they first write their case examples, that's them bringing in their personal elements to this process. And so they are totally committed, at least as most students. And then they move on to that, and then they'll talk about the issues of diversity. But if I started immediately with issues of diversity, which many of the trainings on my campus now, because we've had racial incidents, they go right into discrimination. You should not discriminate. And I'm thinking, oh, right, but they don't have, you have to build awareness, understanding, and skill together. And this, I think anthropology, my beloved anthropology, gives us the tools for that.
Mhm.
oh yeah, definitely, absolutely, and I do think that, look, regardless of where someone comes from, you have to. I mean, one of the big tasks of anthropologists
Yeah,
is communicating between cultures, and that includes subcultures, right? We're
absolutely.
mediators,
Yes.
and
Mhm.
if we just say you can't do this because of X, Y, and Z, no one
Right.
cares. I
No.
mean, that's just our parents telling us what to do all over again, right? And they're not going to absorb that. But when you can say, look,
Yeah.
let's examine
Yeah.
our own identity. What are the ways that we feel discriminated against, and
Yeah.
where does that fit in this whole cultural spectrum?
Yeah.
And then let's take a look at other people. How are they feeling discriminated against?
Yeah.
And you have to start at a place that makes sense for everybody and not just one particular group. I
Yeah.
mean, we have so many deeply
Yeah.
structurally problematic institutions,
Yeah.
and the only way to fix those is to make it real to people,
Mhm.
Yeah.
and not make it something that's, oh, it's just political correctness.
That's right. Oh, which is the silencing mechanism.
Mhm.
Mhm. Mhm.
Absolutely, silencing mechanism. When they pull that one out, I've observed that over the decades when people say, "Oh, the PC." Well, yeah,
Well,
you
it's
just
not just that, it's also what you've hit is their comfort zone, right?
yeah,
You've hit the borders and boundaries of what they're interested in engaging in.
yeah,
And a lot of what of that stuff is a lot of, there's so much implicit in our language that once you reach a certain
yeah,
age of life,
yeah,
you take so much for granted and you
you
make
do.
assumptions, and it's uncomfortable to look at those assumptions.
Yeah,
So it's so important to do it in an accessible way for people.
absolutely,
Mhm.
absolutely, and it's empowering. And like going back now to the cultural context model, if people expand their understanding, critical consciousness, or I use holistic thinking a lot of times, that term. Depending on the audience I'm with, I tailor it to them so that they'll open up and hear it and not their defenses come up. And so critical consciousness, this is very empowering because it's putting the process in their hands, and then they're learning collaborative skills through dialogue. So yeah, I think it's a way that I've been using anyway here in Southern Cal to teach anthropology as well as human services, to be inclusive in human services and never leave out the institutional level with processes and programs. Oh my God. That's another whole presentation, but
I feel like between there too, there's that idea of responsibility. Like you're taking personal responsibility, and you're not able to do that until you have the skills to do that.
yeah.
But then once you're introduced to these concepts, like and writing the case studies themselves, they feel a personal investment. But then when they go out at the end, they may feel like a personal responsibility to the world around them and to each other.
One of the debrief questions that I use, I'm sorry, I think I interrupted the last one. One of the debrief questions that students, after they do right now in the semester, they're doing their own cases and they have to do an action plan. And the debrief for the action plan, how can you use this in your daily life in 2 ways? Very specific. And sure enough, they'll say how they can use it in 2 ways. And it may just be start reading novels by people in culture groups that I don't know about, because it's written by someone in that group about their experience. And if you read several novels, you'll see the diversity within the intra-group. So within this specified group that was defined by an outsider, us, oftentimes the researcher or something. So they start seeing this complexity and this dynamism, and it becomes part of their understanding, a foundation of understanding. And I think that's a good basis then for problem solving and making Ruth Benedict said in the 40s, anthropology's purpose is to make the world safe for human differences. And I think that was in the 40s, and we're in 2020, and we still have a lot of work to do, huh?
Yeah.
Could I make a very small observation?
Yeah.
I'm hearing such wonderful parallels between Mikel Hogan's ideas of the case study and Michael Kilman's ideas of the fictional world building, and that they're two, to my ears, two types of doing the same thing, and they could be imagined as, let's say, isomorphic or parallel. They can also be like a DNA, some kind of exercise in which one is doing both. One based on reality, observing other people and writing about one's own reaction, quote, countertransference stuff. And the other is imagining worlds, such as imagining the world of the people you're writing about. So I really see, maybe I'm projecting so much, I really see such wonderful parallels and interweaving of the two of your tasks, projects, and conceptual models.
Yeah. And relating it to Ria Almeida's cultural context model, the one about the 3 C's and creating fiction, that's a very empowering experience for students, I think. And they're starting to raise their awareness about different assumptions and ways of doing, different cultures. So absolutely, I can see why you say the parallels there. Yeah.
I think I'd like to make a quick comment because some of the stuff that you've got me thinking about, how I've chosen to teach my intro courses compared to how I learned, doing my undergraduate work. And I'm starting to think about, and again, this comes from an applied approach, that how we have these discussions in class, I think is really needs to be changed. I remember in my intro course, we talked a lot about the various anthropologists and their various
Yeah.
theories about how things, how they went and looked at other cultures, and we did
Mm.
different culture studies, and I think a lot of that was good.
Yeah.
But like the way that I've chosen to go about my intro courses is that's teach the skills that you know that's learn how to do this
Right.
instead.
Right.
And if we're going to sort of change the dynamic and get people interested in this field, get in have people have a better way of understanding community, I think we do have to fundamentally change how we approach
Yeah.
education,
Yeah.
especially within the realm of anthropology, where, instead of treating it, and this is the thing that kind of gets me a little crazy, is that anthropology is oftentimes associated with history,
Yeah.
right? And
Right.
it gets put into that context of
Mm.
understanding that something that came before, or that people that we're talking about no longer exist. Like
Yeah.
I've had students that are like, "Oh, I didn't realize there are still Native Americans
Yeah. Oh,
that
I
are
know.
alive," and I'm like,
I know.
I mean,
What? I know. I every
Yeah.
semester I get that.
every semester that happens, and
Yeah. Yes.
so when we do this, when we talk about education and when we talk about how to address these issues, I think
Mhm.
that taking the contemporary approach,
Yeah.
taking the practical approach,
Right.
making it so that these are skills that these students learn, and not just another history class where we
Yeah.
learn, stuff that other people did, but how can
Right.
you apply it? How can you take it?
Yeah.
And that, I think, is, a fundamental change that I really think that we need to address going
I think.
forward.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
So
We need to teach our students how to ask better questions. That's
yeah.
really at the crux of it. That's
critical
like
thinking.
the better
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
What is a good question? What is good evidence?
Yeah.
Right.
And more than anything else, right? And,
Yeah.
and do that in accessible and applicable ways.
Yes. And make it fun.
Mhm.
If they have fun, they totally
Yeah.
in the classroom. I have noisy classrooms, but they learn these things and they're demonstrating by the time they do their term paper.
Yeah.
They can apply these tools because they have to specifically talk about aspects, levels, the barriers with examples, and they specifically have to say what competency behaviors helped you engage in dialogue so you could learn that information. So they're starting to get all this awareness, expanding their awareness of these tools and concepts that are tools. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think anthropology has the holistic way to do it. I work with a lot of psychologists and human services counselors, social workers, educate people with a doctorate in education. And I see if they use the culture concept, it's a framework, a holistic framework for understanding, and people's defenses can decline then, and which allows you then to go forward with problem solving or whatever you're doing, issue identification, these constructing issues that are happening in our department or between departments and such. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it'd be really good to have more of the anthropological lens and the types of things you're talking about in the like corporate
Oh, yeah.
context as well. Because I mean, they are getting a little bit better about how they're
Yeah.
Approaching this kind of stuff. But yeah, I just feel like the kind of skills and tool sets is kind of the part that I
Yeah.
feel like is still lacking.
Absolutely. And if everybody if everybody in the group had these tools, as they apply them, they're learning how to use the tools and they're learning about each other. And that's empowering as well as changing the organization.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Something that kind of I got thinking about is in my medical anthropology course, I was there with probably half the class in my undergraduate were nurses in the field who had been in anywhere from, like 1 to 5 years, who would come back because they'd hit a point where they couldn't advance in their career until they got cross-cultural competencies.
Right.
And the fact that they'd gone through an extensive undergraduate and some postgraduate training,
Yeah.
and something that was known to be a key factor for their success was completely omitted from any part of their curriculum.
Right.
I just really started thinking about that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, and with this school of nursing, we don't have buy-in from across all the nurses, because some of them, they don't think race and misogyny and ageism and transphobia, heterosexism, they don't think that is really an issue. I mean, they don't even think about those things.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they've been teaching for 20 years. And as an anthropologist, I mean, that's the first thing, is the diversity. And is that going to help us communicate here? Or is this person never going to say anything in class because of the way they've been treated? And the person doing it doesn't even know, you know, it's just fraught and so complex. Yeah.
Yeah, I teach CU's diversity course, and before I had the fictional model, we did a lot of other things where we reviewed different kinds of privilege and all kinds of stuff. And in one semester, I used D'Angelo's book, White Fragility, as part of my curriculum. It shut down all conversation.
It does.
And it's such an important book, and it's very powerful, but like you have to be in a certain headspace to be ready for it. And that's a lot of the concepts of anthropology, is that it's not that these concepts don't have important features and validity, and we absolutely should be talking about them, but we have to meet students where they're at. We cannot just hammer them and say, well, you're just a little white fragile guy, aren't you? Right? Because that's not gonna
work.
Gonna work.
No. In fact, a colleague of mine who did some trainings with me for the AAA American Anthro Association, it was in the 90s. She talks about the diversity training she had experienced in her university. She was white, blonde, tall, very articulate, upper middle class background. And she talks about how she could never go to them because of the afterburn. She even wrote an article about afterburn because she was targeted in that training because she was white. That's not the answer. That is not the answer. We got to bring people together. And if they understood cultural and the aspects of culture and social group relations, hierarchies over time, that gives them at least a framework for understanding people's relationships and hatreds and so on.
Yeah, it's all about getting past defenses, right? You cannot get past people's defenses and help them understand what they need to if you just go on the attack. You have to help them understand why it's important to think about these things first. And they have to care. I mean, that's the hardest part about teaching, I think, sometimes, is when you have, especially the class of like 50 or 60, like I sometimes have, is helping people to care. Like, you can probably make 40 of those people care, but it's like reaching that last 10. It's not always possible, but you have to do the best you can, you know?
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And you make them care because you care, right? It's not like that's the key here. That's why we teach. If you're not teaching, if you're teaching and you don't care that they learn, then you should not be teaching at that point.
Exactly.
If all you're going to do is bitch about, oh, the students do this and students are stupid and all this other stuff, like, don't do that stuff.
Don't do that.
We all have frustrating moments with our job, you know, and that's one thing. But then, like, doing it in a public setting where people are just complaining all the time. I mean, we are teaching for a reason. So you whether or not you care shows.
Yeah, it absolutely does. But I see that a lot in some groupings at times. In fact, students as other, you know, the enemy. I'm thinking, oh no, that's just got to move away from that attitude and orientation entirely, or you're just not going to be effective at all.
Absolutely. I want to interject real quick and let everyone know that we've now crossed into the lunch period.
Okay.
But I would like to invite everyone to stick around. If you've got lunch with you right now, then, you know, hang out and we can continue this discussion or jump into other discussions.
Yeah.
Because I mean, if we were at Ghost Ranch right now, we'd be having lunch continuing these discussions.
Yeah.
So, you know, we might as well. But I want to thank you so much for this fantastic presentation. and for the great discussion that has happened afterwards, and getting these different ideas and approaches. And I think it's, again, that's why these events are so important,
Yeah.
to discuss, to talk about these different approaches that